Welcome to Psychologist Talks. On today's episode, we're going to talk about depression. Now, this is a pretty globally understood issue, but I think it bears fleshing things out a little bit more because I think it's just understood as kind of like a broad gestalt. Like, it really doesn't mean a lot for a lot of folks, so we're going to dive deeper into it. Diagnostically, we're talking about two different primary diagnoses that are found in the Diagnostic Manual. On the one hand, major depressive disorder, the big kahuna, and number two, persistent depressive disorder. Now, I will note persistent depressive disorder, I think, often is misunderstood and is actually better labeled as a personality-related issue. And so I encourage you to take a gander at my series on depressive personality disorder, which is not currently in the DSM, but I think holds a lot of weight and speaks true, I think, to a lot of folks who are dealing with chronic depression, aka persistent depressive disorder. But still, today, I'll focus on these two and talk about them in greater detail. First and foremost, though, before going to the diagnoses, I think it's important just to name like the cause of depression and what is underneath depression is just massive. It is just absolutely massive. And this is one of the greatest problems with diagnosing it doesn't communicate anything to me. So if somebody comes in, they're like, I've been diagnosed major depressive disorder, it means literally nothing to me besides the fact that maybe you've had some depression. Congratulations, not terribly helpful, right? A lot of people have depression. And so I think the problem with this is that we're conflating two things. I mean, they could technically be one and the same, but we're the medical model, this sort of idea that there's mental illness out there, makes depression a more confusing construct because depression exists independent of mental illness. It is a clinicalized term, but sadness and melancholia and worthlessness, all these sort of quote unquote symptoms are part and parcel to being a human being. And so, there are cognitive biological correlates, I am sure, but we need to understand that someone can be diagnosed with major depressive disorder and it's more of a contextual personality upbringing sort of thing than it is like a biological entity. Now, there are absolutely those that there's a more of a biological and thereby heritable drive behind somebody's depression. And this is where we're getting into kind of personality conversations because we treat this as one and the same, but it's not. There are people with greater genetic and biological loading and those with more kind of environmental and situational loading. But depressive disorders, as they are currently defined, do not bother to differentiate between the two. And so if you've ever dealt with depression, I think one of the greatest tasks in your own conceptualization of self is trying to feel out how much of it is kind of situationally, relationally, historically, trauma-based driven versus how much could be just something about how your body and brain works that you need to be mindful of. Now, why is this helpful? On the biological side, there's more in the realm of like acceptance, and there could be a need and a benefit, not for everybody, to pursue medication. It's kind of a bracketing effect around these sort of biological drives. Whereas if there's more situational variables, one, I don't think medication is as efficacious. It can take the edge off, but it's not going to eliminate the thing until you actually address the problem at hand. And that could include trauma work. That could include improving relationships. That could include a sense of drive and purpose and meaning, kind of more existential topics in life. And this is going to be really important in guiding how you engage in treatment independent of any diagnosis. How much is situational, contextual within greater my control? And what areas do I need to kind of accept and or find alternative means to manage the condition? I can line up 10 people with major depressive disorder and there will be a smattering of all the above to varying degrees. And we do not talk about this. It's horrible. And I think what's most frustrating for me is the medical model leans on it being an illness and thereby pulling away from situational contextual variables unduly so. I have never met anybody that's been diagnosed with depression that has no contextual situational variables to the depression. Never. Never. I mean, it's probably because I'm a therapist, right? Like they're coming in to get help for a particular reason, for particular things going on in their life. Maybe if I was in psychiatry giving medication, I would see more of the more truly biologically driven. But in my experience, there's always a mixture of both to a certain degree. The degree of mixture is the fascinating question that if you have a provider that you trust, you can feel out. So hopefully that makes sense. It's probably the biggest point I want to make about depressive disorders is the diagnoses do nothing to differentiate between these two phenomena. All right, putting that aside, again, if there's one thing you take from this episode, I hope it's that. Now, on paper, major depressive disorder versus persistent depressive disorder, they're major depressive disorders basically just say there's a recurrence of episodes of depression. These are episodes that last 2 or more weeks that have a litany of symptoms that everybody's basically familiar with. Some of them physiological, some of them cognitive, some of them emotional. And you only have to have so many for you to qualify. And then they have severity specifiers. Like, it's one of the few, too. It fascinates me to this day that there's so few diagnoses with severity specifiers, but to its benefit, major depressive disorder has a sort of mild, moderate, and severe based on the number of symptoms that are present in the quote-unquote condition. And so it's just a fancy term for saying you will have some sort of depressive symptoms. It's not just like a 1 day, multiple day, maybe a week sort of thing. It needs to persist for some degree of time. They say 2 weeks. It's a pretty solid marker, right? You and I have probably had times where we felt sad and melancholic for a week, right? Because something just did not quite go right. That is a different beast than when it's 2 weeks into a month into 3 months, right? Like that definitely deserves its own unique qualification, and major depressive disorder fits that bill. What's really interesting about major depressive disorder as well is it has lots of specifiers. And what specifiers are, it's like these little add-ons. Think of them as like, okay, you've got depression and you've got fill in the blank a la carte. It has things like, I always forget the wording on it. I probably should have looked this up before shooting that. Like hypomanic, I think, or some sort of like hypo something symptoms. It has with melancholic symptoms, with anxious distress is kind of my favorite because it's very rare for me to encounter folks with depressive issues that don't have some anxiety issues a la carte. And so that's a helpful specifier, so you don't have to give an additional anxiety disorder on top of that. So there's a lot of fluidity in the diagnosis itself of like, hey, let's give severity levels, let's give kind of the extra flavorings that come along with it. And it provides a lot of context in that regard. Again, the underlying etiology, the underlying cause is not discussed whatsoever, but at least gives lots of permutations for what it might look like and communicates both with you, a consumer, and or between me and other providers about what might this diagnosis be about-ish. How severe, how persistent is it? Does it have any a la cartes that we're not going to give its own unique diagnosis? Now, this is an overdiagnosed condition, in my opinion, because, somebody comes in for treatment, they need treatment. We rightfully are treatment focused in this profession. It's like, all right, they complain of depression. There's been some degree of recurrence. I mean, I totally forgot to mention, there's like, single episode, recurrent episodes with psychosis. I mean, there's just so many permutations for it. But it's like, okay, somebody comes in depressed, boom, you just kind of stamp that MDD, major depressive disorder label, and you don't really think too much of it. And I think that's just, again, an oversimplification of the issue, the experience of depression. And when do you pull the trigger of it being comorbid with post-traumatic stress disorder, which often has, and its symptoms literally include depressive symptoms. You can go to my PTSD episode to think about that stuff. But, it's really just an easy rubber stamp to give. It really is. All right, you're depressed, boom, right? What I think sometimes we default to is we forget about adjustment disorder. Adjustment disorder is, with a depressed mood is a thing, and you can see my episode for that too. And so it's just this kind of line in the sand that is a little bit gray between the two. I think there are providers out there that over-rely on adjustment disorder because they're reluctant. They don't want to, quote-unquote, over-stigmatize somebody by giving them MDD. But I think just as well, there are people who are like, oh, yeah, you're depressed, and it's pretty significant. All right, your PHQ-9 or some measure looks somewhat elevated, boom, MDD, right? On the PDD side, I thought about giving it its own episode, but I think it's, again, sufficient to talk about it here, and then again point you to the depressive personality disorder episode. It basically just says, hey, this depression, the threshold for meeting what is a major depressive episode for major depressive disorder is not quite there for persistent depressive disorder. It's like, hey, there's a clustering of depressive-based symptoms, a lot of overlap. I'm not sure, it might be identical overlap with at least major depressive disorder. But it's about the persistence of those symptoms over time. And the idea here is there's a period of depression lasting months and months on end, if not years. I mean, I really don't like giving this diagnosis unless I've known depression has been existing for years. And there's no period of remission that goes beyond like 2 months at a time. And so I really communicate to folks, like, think about that. Years of feeling at least a low hum of depression. And then on top of that, the amount of time that the depression goes away never exceeds like a couple months at a time. At some point, that really, experientially, it's someone who is constantly being suffocated by depression. And that is no small thing. That is a huge and encompassing experience of depressive symptoms. Again, it can ebb and flow. When I talk to folks and ask of like, well, there are times when it's better. Does it ever go away completely? And they're often like, no, it's a kind of low hum. Are the times when it gets worse? Yes, absolutely. It also gets worse. Now, this is where PDD has additional qualifiers of like with comorbid major depressive episodes. And this is what what used to be called double depression, of like you can have the persistent depression, which again is it does not have as severe or rigid of symptom requirements. But then there are also periods where there's a big dip into a major depressive episode. So the low hum, if not the persistent annoying hum, is going on, and then boom, double whammy, there's an even bigger dip where someone gets very floridly depressed and would otherwise qualify for a major depressive disorder diagnosis. That's all it is. I think PDD is sometimes missed because, again, the rubber stamp of major depressive disorder is just very easy. And they're just like, well, it's a recurrent severe version of it. It's like, well, yeah, but when is the recurrence and the sort of persistence sufficient to then move over to a PDD diagnosis, which is, I think, more, it kind of honors the persistence and honors the all-encompassing nature of the depression far better than an MDD recurrent severe could ever do. Because MDD severe recurrent argues that there are more periods where it just eliminates, it goes away completely. Whereas PDD goes like, yeah, good luck with that. Maybe for a week, maybe for a month, at most maybe 2 months, and then it's back. It's back. So that's the difference between those two. Trying to think if there's anything else here for depression. Again, I think most people intuitively understand it. So hopefully that's helpful, the differential between those two, the two dominant conditions. And then, again, most importantly, the etiology, what is underneath these conditions, is not talked about diagnostically and is something that I would encourage you as a provider and or you as a consumer to consider and to think about so that you conceptualize your depression more fully and more richly than what our diagnostic manuals provide, at least at present. So, hopefully a helpful episode. Again, shocked I have not done this sooner. I've been on this channel for a while, very passionate about depression, and hadn't made this episode, so glad to offer it. And yeah, thanks for listening and watching, and as always, stay curious.